Before the video starts, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. So, finally, in a forum where people share what really happened to them, this story began with a cardboard box on the kitchen table and a blue-covered scrapbook on top. Margaret Miller, a night shift nurse for years, had come home with that mixture of tiredness that sticks to your clothes and a lump in her chest that wouldn't go away. She'd stopped by the wedding rehearsal just to drop off the gift she'd prepared by hand, laminated photos, bus tickets saved because they marked moments, the hospital bracelet from Daniel's first admission as a child. When she opened the door, she found no hugs or thanks. She found a short, emotionless sentence that left her empty inside. She returned to the subway with the scrapbook clutched to her chest, without looking at anyone, and arrived at her kitchen the way one arrives from a tough shift, in silence. He sat down, flipped through the pages one by one with fingers that smelled of disinfectant, and felt that everything he had taken for granted, that family is sustained by concrete actions, had been shattered in a hallway a few meters from a living room with little lights and other people's laughter. That night there was no television, no music, no unanswered messages, just the hum of the refrigerator and the phone vibrating on the mantelpiece with calls she didn't want to read. Margaret thought about the years of double shifts, the Christmases in uniform, the times she said yes to overtime so Daniel would never want for anything. The album was open to the college graduation page, the cap askew, the big smile, her own face in the background, disheveled and happy. She didn't cry immediately. First came a rare calm, the kind in which one understands that one doesn't need to expose oneself to a place where one isn't wanted. She turned off her cell phone, put away the blue dress she had hung on the closet door, and made a simple, concrete decision, like the decisions tired and dignified people make. The next day, she wouldn't go to the wedding. Not as punishment, not out of pride, out of self-respect, because no one deserves to sit through a ceremony knowing they'd be preferred out. The next morning, New York City continued its rhythm as if nothing had happened. The sound of cars on the avenue, the smell of coffee from her neighbor who always got up early, the distant sound of the train rising over Queens. Margaret dressed without much thought, just to maintain a routine. On the table, her phone was still full of messages, some affectionate, others inquisitive, all asking if she was okay. She didn't answer any of them. She made her coffee, sat by the window, and looked at the blue dress hanging in the light. It was pretty, sober, bought with months of savings. She had imagined it for a day of pride, not exclusion. And while the city moved on as if mothers with broken hearts didn't exist, she allowed herself something she hadn't done in years, to stay still. As the clock struck noon, the phone rang again. First it was Margaret's sister, then a cousin, all speaking in a hurry. The ceremony hadn't started, they said, because something had happened. Jessica had disappeared from the dressing room. Daniel was searching for explanations. The guests waited in confusion. Margaret felt a chill and simply listened. Minutes later, her sister's voice broke into tears. The wedding was off. The photos, the rumors, the betrayal, it all exploded in a matter of minutes. And while the city continued to breathe to the rhythm of the honking horns, in a small apartment in Queens, a mother understood that sometimes not being present is what stops a tragedy. The news spread quickly, as it often does when a scandal involves expensive dresses and a booked church. Within hours, social media was filled with photos of the bride fleeing the scene, cryptic messages, and fabricated versions. Margaret didn't know what to believe until her own son called her, in a broken voice she hadn't heard since he was a child. He told her everything, that he had discovered the messages between Jessica and her boss, that a friend had shown him the evidence minutes before he walked down the aisle, that his world had collapsed while the guests applauded, unaware of what was happening. She listened silently, her hands shaking, knowing that this call was a cry from the depths of a fresh wound. For the rest of the day, Margaret didn't leave the Tower house. She turned on the television just to confirm that everything was real, and there it was. The newscasts repeating the headlines, the images of the closed church, the confused faces of the guests. What she didn't expect was to see her own name in the middle of it all. The initial reports said that the groom's mother had sabotaged the marriage, that she had manipulated Daniel into giving up, that her jealousy and resentment were known to everyone. It was as if someone had turned the story on its head and painted her as a villain. She slammed the television shut, took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long time, was afraid to go outside. That night, social media erupted into a storm. Anonymous comments, cropped photos, headlines playing on words like controlling mother and wedding ruined by jealousy. Margaret didn't understand algorithms or media strategies, but she understood the tone of cruelty. It was the same one she'd seen in hospital waiting rooms, when someone enjoys seeing the other give up. She checked her phone, and the messages that had once been supportive were now filled with accusations. Old co-workers who barely said hello in the hallway wrote to her ironically. Distant relatives asked for her version. And she, exhausted, thought only of her son. Daniel didn't deserve that, not after everything he'd been through. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel something close to relief. He'd been freed from a lie before it was too late. 2 days passed in which Margaret barely ate or slept. She tried to concentrate on the small routines, watering the plants, folding laundry, listening to the noise in the neighborhood, but the tension was constant. Every time her phone vibrated, her stomach sank. Until one morning a thick envelope arrived with a legal seal. She opened it, at first unable to understand what it said. Suit for interference with contractual relations and defamation. It was a long sentence that sounded like a punishment. She called her friend Linda, a secretary at a law firm, to explain. When Linda read the document, she was silent for a long time before saying, "They're using you, Maggie. This is all a plan." And in that moment, the nurse who had spent her life solving other people's emergencies understood that now it was her turn to save herself. Linda arrived that same afternoon with a folder full of papers and a look that mixed anger and concern. They sat in the kitchen, the fan whirring, and went over each page. The Hayeses, Jessica's family, were practically bankrupt. They had lost properties, investments, and even the father's business was about to be foreclosed. The entire marriage had been a strategy to use Daniel's salary and reputation as a financial lifeline. Linda showed her the clauses of the prenuptial agreement. There were percentages, joint accounts, and a sentence that made it clear that almost all of Daniel's future income would go into the name of his wife's family. Margaret couldn't believe it, not because she doubted it, but because the reality of it was so strong that she was ashamed she hadn't seen it before. For hours, Margaret and Linda looked up names, compared dates, and printed documents. The nurse, accustomed to the precision of medications and clinical reports, applied the same rigor to gathering evidence. She wanted to understand everything before confronting anyone. Daniel, for his part, remained silent, locked in his apartment, not answering calls. She didn't press the issue. She knew that the grief of a child also requires space. When she finished reviewing the last printed email, Margaret leaned back in her chair and looked out the window at the city lights. She remembered a phrase she used to repeat to her younger patients. The truth doesn't always heal quickly, but it always prevents infection. And for the first time, she understood that this truth was for her too. The following days were a mixture of physical exhaustion and mental clarity. Margaret, who had spent half her life resolving other people's crises, began to move with the calm of someone who knows she's right, even if the whole world thinks otherwise. She filed each document in numbered envelopes, noted dates, printed copies, all with the almost surgical precision that her profession had given her. In the neighborhood, some avoided her. Others, silently, left small gestures of support. A neighbor offered her freshly baked bread. A hospital nurse wrote that he believed her version of events. Daniel was still absent, processing the disaster in his own way, and Margaret understood. She knew she couldn't force a reunion, that children need to discover the truth on their own, even when their mother already knows it. One afternoon, as she was sorting through the papers on the table, she looked at the blue album that was still there, untouched. She opened it and found a photo of Daniel at just 8 years old, smiling, holding an ice cream cone. Ego. That moment, doubt struck her. Had she done the right thing by not going to the wedding? But as she thought about the humiliation of that night, she knew she had. Her absence was her only act of self-respect. And if anyone reading this story has read this far, perhaps they understand the kind of tiredness that sleep doesn't cure. Tell me where you're watching this from, if you've ever felt that way. Those human coincidences also sustain the writer and the listener. With a deep breath, Margaret closed the album and decided she would no longer be a spectator to her own pain. The next day, Margaret called the hotel where the Hayeses had hosted a private dinner. It wasn't an open invitation, but she knew everyone would attend, even Daniel, driven by the desire to close the subject once and for all. She dressed in the same blue dress she'd saved for the wedding, not to relive the pain, but to reclaim her place. She walked the streets of Manhattan as if they were a hospital hallway before surgery, fearful, but also purposeful. The air was thick with humidity and noise, but in her head there was only silence. When she arrived at the hotel lobby, she saw the flowers, the flashing phones, the forced smiles. Everything looked the same as the day of the canceled ceremony, only now appearances smelled of lies. Dinner was taking place in a closed room, with soft music and glasses filled with expensive wine. Margaret entered unannounced. Some turned around in surprise, others pretended not to see her. At the head table were the Hayeses, immaculately dressed, and their son, visibly exhausted. No one spoke at first. She approached slowly, a cardboard folder under her arm. She placed it on the table, opened it, and revealed the documents. Bankruptcy filings, emails, the entire prenuptial agreement. Each page was a piece of a puzzle of greed. The silence grew heavy, so thick that not even the sound of cutlery could break it. Margaret didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to shout. She simply said, "Here's the truth that has been so denied." Daniel looked up, and for the first time, he understood everything without any explanation. Jessica tried to react, but her words stumbling. She said it was all a misunderstanding, that the documents were old, that the photos proved nothing. Yet Margaret remained motionless, holding her gaze with the serenity of someone who has seen too many excuses die in the emergency room. Every time Jessica tried to speak, Daniel flipped to another piece of paper, another piece of mail, another number. His son's face changed, as if each line he read erased a piece of the story he thought he knew. The Hayeses, sitting beside him, avoided his gaze. The bride's father was sweating. The mother, back straight, sipped wine. At that table laden with china and gilt, Margaret wasn't an intruder. She was the only person with nothing to hide. When Daniel finished reading, there was absolute silence. The only sounds were the hum of the air, conditioner, and the sound of a fork falling to the floor. Then he uttered the same words Jessica had said to his mother at the rehearsal door. "You are not part of this family." But this time, they were directed at her, at the woman who had played with his life. Jessica lowered her gaze without tears or any defense. Margaret watched the scene without joy, but with a strange peace. It wasn't revenge she felt, but relief. Her son was finally seeing clearly. It was as if a veil had fallen not only from his eyes, but also from the bond between them, freeing him from a carefully constructed illusion. When it was all over, no one applauded or raised their voices. Margaret simply picked up her folder and left the room. The hotel hallway was lined with mirrors, and in each one she saw a different reflection. The tired mother, the steadfast nurse, the woman who had finally stopped justifying herself. Outside it was raining, one of those fine rains that drips without you noticing at first. She walked without an umbrella, letting the water wash away her makeup and her fatigue. The city, indifferent, was still alive. Taxis passing by, couples arguing, someone playing a saxophone on the corner. For the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't feel invisible. She had found her voice again, not through shouting, but through actions. And that, in her silent world, was worth more than any public apology. That same night, Linda went to visit her. She was carrying a USB flash drive with all the scanned documents. They sat in front of the computer, reviewing the evidence one by one. This time not as friends, but as two women aware they had something big on their hands. Linda suggested sending it to a journalist she knew, someone with a reputation for publishing difficult stories without giving in to pressure. Margaret hesitated for a few seconds. She didn't want revenge, just to clear her name. But remembering the threats, the lies online, and the way everyone had bought into the charade, she silently agreed. They prepared an email with the files, a full account of the events, and a simple subject line: the truth behind a canceled marriage. The journalist responded the next day, almost immediately. She asked for a brief call to confirm the details, and Margaret, her voice still uncertain, recounted everything without embellishment. The years of sacrifice, the exclusion at the trial door, the media manipulation, the lawsuit. On the other end of the line, the reporter didn't interrupt her once. Only at the end did she say, "This deserves to be told with respect." In less than 48 hours, the story was published on the main news site. The headline was compelling: the financial scheme behind a luxury wedding in New York. Photos of the prenuptial agreement and bankruptcy records filled the screen. And in the center, a discreet image: Margaret, in her nurse's uniform, taken from an old family portrait. The post went viral in a matter of hours. Where there had once been insults, there were now apologies. Strangers called her brave, an example, a real mother. Margaret didn't let herself be carried away by euphoria. She knew that social media is as volatile as smoke. But seeing her name cleared of lies restored a peace she thought she had lost. Daniel was the first to write to her. Not a long message, but 3 words that she read with pent-up tears. "I believe you, Mom." That simple phrase was worth more than any headline. In her apartment, in front of the same blue album she had kept as a symbol of failure, she now saw something different. Not a reminder of loss, but evidence that even silences can speak volumes. In the following days, journalists, lawyers, and curious onlookers began to circle her building. Some wanted interviews, others sought details. Margaret avoided all of that. She didn't want to be a public figure, just a woman who had stood up for her truth. She returned to work at the hospital, although her colleagues viewed her differently, with respect. In the hallways, patients smiled at her, as if her story had become part of the city's collective buzz. At night, the sound of ambulances reminded her that life went on, that people suffered and healed every day. That familiar routine became her refuge. Because between the shifts, the cold lights, and the smell of disinfectant, she found the only kind of peace she had always understood, that of serving without expecting anything. Daniel, meanwhile, had returned to his job at the law firm where he was an intern. What he had experienced had a profound effect on him, but it also gave him a newfound clarity. When he went to visit his mother, there were no speeches or elaborate apologies. They just sat in silence for a while, sharing a cup of coffee. Margaret looked at him and thought how ironic it all was. The same son who had once believed she was interfering now knew that without her intervention everything would have ended in disaster. They spoke little, but a glance was enough to understand what each other was feeling. At one point he took her hand and said, "I don't know how to thank you." She smiled, gently squeezing his hand. Nothing more was needed. As the weeks passed, the case became a national topic. Television programs analyzed it. Online commentators discussed morals and money, and some sensationalist websites attempted to reconstruct Jessica's story as if she were a victim. But most understood the truth. What had happened was a carefully planned emotional and financial fraud. Margaret watched it all from her living room, without rancor. Instead of enjoying the commotion, she felt a mixture of relief and sadness. She knew that behind every scandal there are real lives, scars that aren't seen on screen. Linda insisted that she give an interview, but she refused. "I already spoke once, and that was enough," she told her. Her intention was never to destroy anyone, only to regain the dignity that had been stolen from her, with lies. One night, as she packed the documents into a box, she thought about everything she had learned. That the truth, when supported by evidence, doesn't need to scream. That silence can also be a defense. And that a mother's love isn't measured by how many times she protects, but by how much she lets her child walk alone. Outside, the city sparkled in the rain, and for the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't feel she needed to hide from the world. She made herself a simple dinner, lit a candle, and allowed herself to enjoy the peaceful sound of the rain on the window. Sometimes, she thought, life comes down to just that, surviving the storm without losing the ability to light a candle. The following Sunday, Margaret and Daniel went together to the park where they used to go when he was a child. They had 2 coffees and the Blue Album. They sat on the same bench as always, facing the lake, in silence. The breeze stirred the leaves and the sound of ducks broke the stillness. Daniel flipped through the pages with a different expression, no longer one of guilt, but of gratitude. "I never understood how much you did for me until all this happened," he said, his voice breaking. She didn't respond, just looked at him with that mixture of pride and tenderness that the years can't erase. The sun filtered through the trees, and for a moment, everything seemed simple again. Mother and son, without masks, without an audience, without judgment, just 2 people who had survived the lie. That same afternoon, as they walked back, Margaret looked at her reflection in a storefront window and recognized herself. Not as the victim of the scandal, nor as the heroine everyone admired, but as a woman who had learned to endure. And if you're listening to this story this far, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that silence can also be a form of strength. You don't always have to shout to defend the truth. Sometimes it's enough to stand up for it, even when no one believes you. Margaret took a deep breath, squeezed her son's hand, and continued walking, convinced that there is no greater justice than living in peace after having been honest. As time passed, the story faded from the media, as everything does. New scandals made headlines, new dramas replaced hers. But for Margaret, it was a relief. Returning to anonymity was like coming home. She focused on her work, caring for her patients, making coffee in the morning without looking at her phone. At the hospital, some still recognized her, and she smiled kindly, but with no desire to talk about it. She had understood that life didn't need an audience to have meaning. What she enjoyed most were the everyday things, the chats with Linda after her shift, the short calls from Daniel, the quiet Sunday walks. In those simple gestures, she found a happiness more real than any headline. Daniel, for his part, began to excel in his career. He worked with dedication, but with a more critical eye toward power and corruption. The experience with the Hayeses had changed him profoundly. He no longer sought external recognition or validation. His greatest achievement was knowing he could look at his mother without feeling ashamed. On more than one occasion, he asked her for advice on difficult cases, and Margaret listened attentively, proud to see in him the same ethics she had tried to instill in him since he was a child. They had been through a storm, but one of those that clears the air and makes everything clearer. And although they never said it out loud, they both knew that this disaster had been, deep down, a salvation. A year later, Margaret received an unexpected letter. It came from the school where Daniel had attended as a child. Inside was an invitation. They wanted to pay tribute to the mothers who had worked in essential services during the health crises. At first, she hesitated, but Daniel insisted. "This time, not for me, but for you," he said. On the day of the event, Margaret arrived with her uniform ironed and a serene expression. As she stepped onto the small stage to receive the award, she felt a suppressed emotion, not from the applause but from the understanding that her life, with all she had endured, had left a worthy mark. As she held the diploma, she remembered the night Jessica had kicked her out the door and thought about how much she had changed since then. After the ceremony, mother and son went for a walk through the streets of Brooklyn. The air was fresh, and the city had that special glow that comes with days when anything seems possible. Margaret glanced at Daniel, noticing how he had transformed into a steadfast, stronger, but also more empathetic man. He asked her if she had ever wanted to do anything differently with her life. She smiled and replied, "Maybe rest a little more, but I wouldn't change a thing." And she meant it. Every shift, every sleepless night, every tear, even every humiliation, had brought her to this moment. She finally understood that her greatest triumph was not avoiding pain, but surviving it without losing her essence. Over time, Margaret began to write short texts in a notebook she kept next to her blue scrapbook. They weren't grand reflections or phrases from a book, just fragments of memory. "I slept 8 hours straight today. Linda brought me warm bread." Daniel smiled without sadness. These notes became her way of being grateful for things that had previously gone unnoticed. When she felt anxious or sad, she would reread them and remind herself that she had survived something much worse. She no longer sought justice, recognition, or even apologies. Only peace of mind. And in that simple search, she discovered a kind of freedom she'd never had before. The freedom that comes when a person stops needing others to validate their story. One afternoon, while folding clean sheets at the hospital, she overheard 2 young nurses talking about the woman in the E. Miller case. They laughed, telling their distorted version of events, unaware that she was right behind them. Margaret wasn't offended. She just kept folding, thinking that the true story is rarely known in full. Deep down, she was moved to see how her name had become almost an urban legend. When she left her shift, the sun was setting between the buildings, and the noise of the traffic seemed less harsh. She thought that, perhaps, this was the perfect closure, for people to remember her in their own way, while she continued living without resentment, with dignity, and a hard-earned calm. Over the months, Linda convinced her to attend a community group that met on Saturdays at the neighborhood library. They were people who shared stories of loss, betrayal, breakups, or new opportunities. At first, Margaret just listened, but one day, without planning it, she spoke. She spoke without a script, recounting how she had felt shame, fear, and anger, but also how, little by little, she had regained her center. She didn't mention names or details. There was no need to. People listened in silence, and at the end, several women approached her to thank her. One of them said, "I too stood outside a door once." That comment moved her more than any award or headline, because she understood that her story, told simply, served as a reminder to others that dignity is also defended in silence. After that meeting, Margaret began going every week, not to talk, but to be around. She made coffee, arranged chairs, brought cookies. It was her way of giving back to the world without fuss or fanfare. Linda used to joke that she was now the nurse for broken souls, and Margaret responded with a tired but genuine smile. Deep down, she liked this new version of herself, calmer, wiser, less willing to carry blame that wasn't hers. She no longer needed to justify her decisions. She knew she had done the right thing. Sometimes when she returned home and passed in front of the mirror, she would look at herself and say quietly, "It was worth it." And for the first time, she truly believed it. One autumn morning, while walking to the hospital, Margaret stopped in front of a flower shop. In the window were white lilies, her mother's favorite flowers. Without thinking twice, she bought a small bouquet and took it with her to work. She placed it in the break room next to the coffee machine. No one knew why, but they all noticed the change in the atmosphere, the fresh smell, the calm. For Margaret, this gesture was a way of bringing things full circle, of paying tribute not only to her mother, but also to all the women who had endured more than the world imagined. When Linda asked her why lilies, she simply replied, "Because they grow even where no one plants them." And her entire story was condensed into that sentence. That night, when she returned home, she found an envelope in the mailbox. Inside was a handwritten letter. It was from Jessica. The first lines were clumsy, full of excuses, but the tone changed toward the end. She apologized. She said she was living in another city, far from everything, and that she needed to start over. Margaret read it silently, without anger or compassion. She simply folded it and put it in the blue album, between the pages of the chapter she had already closed. She didn't reply. Not because she held a grudge, but because she understood that sometimes forgiveness doesn't require words, but distance. She closed the album, made a cup of tea, and let the sound of the kettle fill the comfortable silence of her home. With winter came the first snowfalls, and Margaret began to notice the passage of time on her body. Her hands ached a little more after her shifts, and the subway stairs seemed longer, but at the same time she felt like her mind had never been sharper. Every day she found small reasons to keep going. A kind conversation, a patient who was getting better, a brief message from Daniel. On one of those cold nights, as she watched the snow fall from the window, she thought about all that had changed in a single year. There were no great triumphs, no riches, no fame, but something much more valuable: inner peace. And she understood that, for someone who lived so long amidst noise, peace is the greatest form of success. In February, Daniel invited her to see his new office. It was a small space, but full of energy and open books. Upon entering, Margaret saw the blue album on a shelf, the same one that had once been a symbol of pain. Her son had framed it, leaving a page open with a photo of them on their first day of school. "So I don't forget where I come from," he explained. She looked at him excitedly, with the silent pride of mothers who don't need to say it. They had lunch together in a modest restaurant, and he told her about his plans to offer free legal help to people who have been scammed. Margaret smiled. She knew that everything she had experienced had served to shape the righteous man she now saw before her. That night, upon returning home, Margaret lit a lamp and wrote on the last page of her notebook. She didn't search for pretty phrases or morals. She simply wrote, "Today I'm fine." She realized that this, which seemed so simple, was something she hadn't been able to say for years. She poured herself a glass of wine, sat by the window, and let the city breathe with her. From her high apartment, she could see the taxis crossing the avenue, life going on as usual, and she understood that in the end, overcoming doesn't come with applause, but with the serene silence of someone who no longer has anything to prove. She quietly gave thanks for everything, for the pain, for the truth, and for the opportunity to start over without fear. Weeks later, Margaret decided to donate part of her savings to a scholarship program for children of single nurses. She didn't announce it or post it on social media. She just did it because she knew what it meant to raise a child with more love than resources. As she dropped the envelope in the hospital mailbox, she felt a quiet emotion, one that needed no witnesses. She walked home with a firm step, enjoying the cool air and the sound of her own footsteps on the sidewalk. At her door, before entering, she looked up at the gray New York sky and murmured, "Now it's all worth it." Then she closed the door, put some water in the tea, and smiled, knowing that, finally, her story didn't hurt her. It just belonged to her.